For decades, Boeing owned the middle of the sky without even having to think about it. There was a time when airlines did not debate what aircraft to use for routes carrying 200 to 250 passengers over medium to long distances. The answer was automatic: the Boeing 757. It was powerful, overbuilt, unapologetically American, and perfectly suited to routes that were too long for narrowbodies and too thin for widebodies. Transatlantic flights from the East Coast to Europe, high-altitude airports, hot weather operations, dense domestic routes that needed range without the operating cost of a widebody. The 757 did it all, and it did it with margin to spare. Built from 1981 to 2004, the 757 represented engineering at its most purposeful. The aircraft featured enormous wings with nearly 50% more area than comparable narrowbodies, engines producing over 40,000 pounds of thrust rivaling early Boeing 747 power plants, and a design philosophy that prioritized capability over compromise. The 757-200, the primary variant with 913 units delivered, could seat around 200 passengers and fly them over 3,915 nautical miles. Its wing design, originally intended to provide short field performance, inadvertently created an aircraft capable of crossing oceans. Airlines like United, Delta, American, and Icelandair built entire network strategies around what the 757 could do that nothing else could match. When Boeing shut down 757 production in 2004 after delivering 1,050 aircraft, it believed the market had moved on. Fuel prices were rising. Airlines wanted efficiency, not excess power. On paper, it looked logical. The 757 was aging, heavy, and expensive to build. Manufacturing tooling was quickly dismantled, key suppliers moved on, and the entire industrial infrastructure supporting the aircraft disappeared. Boeing assumed that whatever gap the 757 left behind would be absorbed naturally by smaller aircraft flying more frequently, or by larger jets flying fewer rotations. That assumption would turn out to be one of the most expensive miscalculations in modern aviation history. As the 757 faded into retirement, airlines quietly realized something unsettling. There was no true replacement. The Boeing 737, even in its latest iterations, could not match the range with a full payload. The 737 MAX 10, expected to achieve certification in 2026, offers roughly 3,100 nautical miles of range compared to over 4,000 for the 757-200. While the MAX 10 can seat between 188 and 204 passengers in typical configurations, closing much of the capacity gap, the range deficit remains fundamental. The aircraft's short landing gear constrains engine size, and every additional improvement requires workarounds layered upon workarounds. The Airbus 320 family could not handle certain performance requirements without compromises. Widebodies like the Boeing 787-800 were too large at 248 passengers and 7,305 nautical miles, too expensive, and too much airplane for routes that simply did not need that capacity. A gap was opening in the market, and at first, no one fully grasped how large it would become. Airbus noticed before Boeing did. Instead of designing an entirely new airplane, Airbus played a long, patient game. They stretched the A320 platform incrementally, introducing new generation engines, larger fuel tanks, and refined aerodynamic improvements to steadily increase both range and efficiency. First came the A321, then came the Neo with its new engine options. Then came performance upgrades, higher weights, and longer range packages. Each step looked modest on its own. Together, they quietly pushed the A321neo family directly into territory once owned exclusively by the 757. The real game changer emerged with the A321XLR, featuring structural strengthening to support a higher maximum takeoff weight of 101 metric tons, a revised flap design, and a new integrated rear center fuel tank. With optional auxiliary tanks, the A321XLR can fly as far as 4,700 nautical miles, some 15% more than the A321LR, and actually exceeding the 757's range while delivering 30% lower fuel burn per seat compared to previous generation competitor aircraft. The aircraft maintains over 90% commonality with the A321neo, operated by the same crew, powered by the same CFM LEAP 1A engines, and featuring the same cabin flexibility. By the time Boeing realized what was happening, airlines were flying narrowbody aircraft across the Atlantic with fuel efficiency numbers that would have seemed absurd a decade earlier. Routes that once required a 757 were now being flown profitably by aircraft with a single aisle and two engines optimized for endurance rather than brute force. Airbus had not just filled the gap, but redefined it entirely. Inside Boeing, the alarms began to ring. Engineers, planners, and sales teams all pointed to the same uncomfortable truth. Boeing no longer had a competitive aircraft in the so-called middle of the market. The idea of a new airplane began to circulate under a simple name: the new Midsize Airplane. In 2015, Boeing determined the market was large enough to launch a new design. By 2017, multiple airlines expressed interest in a composite 7-abreast twin-aisle design. The new Midsize Airplane, informally branded as the Boeing 797, was envisioned as a modern successor to both the 757 and part of the 767 market. The aircraft would be available in two primary configurations: a 225-seater with 5,000 nautical miles range and a 275-seater with 4,500 nautical miles range, twin-aisle comfort with single-aisle economics, a composite wing, advanced aerodynamics, new engines designed specifically for this class of aircraft, with thrust requirements between 40,000 and 45,000 pounds. At a projected price of $65 to $75 million, the NMA was expected to generate 30% more revenue than narrowbodies and have 40% lower trip costs than the widebodies it would replace. Third-party forecasts for this market varied from 2,000 to 4,000 aircraft over 20 years. More than 50 airlines provided input on the program, with carriers like Emirates, Qantas, United, Delta, and American expressing strong interest. At the 2017 Paris Air Show, Boeing discussed design details, with entry into service targeted around 2024 to 2025. On paper, it was exactly what airlines wanted. In reality, it terrified Boeing's leadership. Launching a new aircraft program would mean admitting that the 737 platform had reached its limits. Development costs were estimated between $15 and $25 billion, with some projections reaching as high as $50 billion. In an environment where Boeing's management emphasized shareholder returns and near-term financial stability, committing to such a costly new aircraft program became increasingly difficult to justify. As Boeing hesitated, Airbus sold. The A321neo LR and later the A321XLR became the aircraft Boeing had chosen not to build. Airlines ordered them by the hundreds. As of late 2024, Airbus had secured more than 500 orders for the A321XLR from 26 customers worldwide. American Airlines ordered 50. United Airlines also ordered 50 to replace its aging Boeing 757-200 fleet of 40 jets averaging 26 years of age, planning to begin international service with the aircraft in 2025 and take first delivery in 2026. Qantas converted 26 previous orders to the XLR variant and added 10 more, targeting routes like Cairns to Tokyo and Melbourne to Singapore. On October 30, 2024, Spanish flag carrier Iberia became the launch operator of the A321 XLR, receiving the world's first delivery. The aircraft, configured with 182 passengers in a two-class layout with lie-flat business class seats, operated initial regional flights before its first transatlantic mission from Madrid to Boston in November. In December 24, Aer Lingus became the second operator globally, taking delivery of its first of 6 A321 XLRs, configured with 16 full-flat business class and 168 economy class seats. Airbus delivered 766 commercial aircraft in 2024, with key highlights including the first-ever A321 XLR deliveries. Demonstrating sustained market demand, they replaced aging 757s. They opened new point-to-point routes. They allowed carriers to experiment with thinner long-haul markets without committing a widebody. They reshaped route planning itself. Boeing watched this happen in real time. Instead of committing fully to the 797, Boeing attempted to buy time. Executives spoke about market uncertainty. They floated alternative concepts: hybrid designs, light twin aisles, advanced narrowbodies. Each iteration pushed the decision further into the future. On January 30, 2019, then CEO Dennis Muilenburg clarified that whether to offer the NMA for sale would be decided later that year, with entry into service still targeted for 2025, but the delay risked missing 757 replacement opportunities. By October 2019, Boeing was studying a re-engined 767X derivative as a potential alternative. In December 2019, United Airlines placed its first narrow-body Airbus order since 2006, choosing 50 A321 XLRs to replace its 757 fleet. Then came the 737 MAX crisis. The grounding of the MAX consumed Boeing's attention, resources, and credibility for years. Engineers were reassigned. Management priorities shifted from innovation to survival. Regulators scrutinized every design decision. The idea of launching a brand new airplane under that level of oversight became even more daunting. By early 2020, newly appointed CEO David Calhoun announced a revised approach to the NMA, signaling a shift in priorities. He stated that a clean sheet reevaluation was necessary, noting that since initial design work began, things had changed. The competitive playing field was different, and Boeing would start with a clean sheet of paper again. The 797 quietly slipped into limbo. In 2022, Calhoun indicated that more time was needed before committing to the next aircraft, stating it would take at least a couple of years before Boeing was confident that digital design tools tested on programs like the T-7 trainer jet were mature enough to implement on the next airplane. By early 2024, further complications arose when a 737 MAX 9 operated by Alaska Airlines experienced an in-flight door plug failure, resulting in intense scrutiny and management changes. Boeing's 777X program faced persistent delays, now targeting late 2027 delivery. Compounding these challenges, Boeing contended with a backlog of more than 6,000 orders estimated to take over a decade to fulfill at current production rates. The most recent concrete statement came in September 2024, when Boeing announced a new labor agreement which included a commitment to build its next new airplane in Washington state. Commercial aircraft CEO Stephanie Pope confirmed that Boeing's roots are in Washington, where generations of workers have built incredible airplanes, and the team in the Puget Sound region will build Boeing's next airplane. While not explicitly confirmed as the 797, the timing renewed speculation that the NMA might still move forward. However, very little concrete information has emerged about actual development, leaving it unclear whether Boeing is even pursuing a new clean-sheet aircraft, and if so, whether it will be mid-sized. By the early 2020s, the verdict was unavoidable. Boeing no longer controlled the middle of the market. Airbus did. The A321neo XLR could fly routes that Boeing simply could not match with any aircraft currently in production. Airlines planning their fleets for the next 2 decades were making decisions without Boeing in the conversation for this segment. Industry analysts widely believe that Boeing cannot launch the 797 before the early 2030s at the earliest. Even if Boeing were to commit today, bringing an aircraft to market takes 6 to 7 years, meaning the earliest possible entry into service would be well into the next decade. The consequences extended far beyond sales numbers. Fleet commonality began to shift dramatically. Pilots trained on Airbus cockpits stayed with Airbus. Maintenance infrastructure leaned Airbus. Route planners optimized around Airbus performance profiles. Once those ecosystems form, they are extremely difficult to disrupt. By July 2025, data demonstrated that the A320 family was eclipsing the 737 in total deliveries, a milestone event representing Boeing's massive strategic error. Boeing found itself trapped by its own past success. The 737 had been too successful. The platform was stretched, re-engined, and modernized repeatedly instead of replaced. Each upgrade delayed the inevitable. Each compromise accumulated technical debt. When the moment finally arrived that demanded a clean sheet replacement, Boeing was financially, politically, and culturally unprepared to act decisively. Airbus, by contrast, had played the long game. Incremental evolution backed by a willingness to invest early and accept lower margins initially. By extracting every drop of performance from an existing design, Airbus achieved something remarkable, making the A321 competent in a role it was never originally designed for. Today, the absence of a Boeing midsize aircraft is no longer theoretical. It is visible on route maps, in order books, and in airline earnings calls. Boeing still sells airplanes. The 787 remains popular. The 777 continues to dominate certain markets, but the middle remains empty. Analysis shows approximately 470 active 757s remaining from the 1,218 built, with major operators including Delta Airlines with 124, United Airlines with 77, FedEx Express with 109 freighters, and UPS Airlines with 75. These aircraft average well over 20 years of age, with some approaching 30. The replacement wave is inevitable and imminent, and in aviation, empty space never stays empty for long. New challengers are emerging. JetZero, a startup developing a blended wing-body design designated the Z4, has attracted investment from United Airlines, Delta Airlines, and Alaska Airlines. The company promises 50% lower fuel burn per passenger than similar-sized aircraft like the Boeing 767, targeting entry into service this decade. Delta announced in March 2025 that it is partnering with JetZero on a revolutionary, more sustainable aircraft, calling it bold and important work as Delta aims for net zero emissions by 2050. The 797 may still happen one day. Boeing has not ruled it out completely. Concepts continue to evolve quietly. Studies continue. But every year that passes makes the business case harder, not easier. Airbus is no longer waiting. Airlines are no longer asking. The middle of the market moved on. Engine developments from CFM International and Pratt & Whitney that might power a future NMA are not expected to enter service until the mid-2030s, further constraining Boeing's timeline even if it decided to launch tomorrow. What makes this story so compelling is not that Boeing failed to build an airplane, it is that they failed to decide. In aviation, timing matters as much as technology. Being right too late can be worse than being wrong early. The 757 was built for a world that no longer exists. The A321XLR was built for the one that replaced it. Boeing stood between those two realities, hesitant, cautious, and ultimately sidelined. And now, the sky that Boeing once dominated is flying on aircraft they chose not to build. Routes from Madrid to Boston, from New York to Europe, from Australia to Southeast Asia, all being opened or transformed by A321XLR's operating missions that Boeing's current fleet simply cannot efficiently serve. If aviation history teaches us anything, it is that no dominance is permanent. Market leadership, once lost, is extraordinarily difficult to reclaim. The question is not whether Boeing will return to the middle of the market, but what it will cost them to do so, and whether the industry will still be waiting when they finally arrive. By the time Boeing could realistically launch and certify a new midsize aircraft, Airbus will have delivered hundreds of A321XLRs, established itself as the default choice for this mission profile, and potentially begun developing the next evolution beyond that. Because in aviation, the most dangerous thing is not failure, it is hesitation. Boeing hesitated when decisive action was required, studied when commitment was needed, and deferred when airlines were ready to order. That hesitation created an opening that Airbus exploited with precision and patience. The 757 passes the torch to Airbus as Boeing watches from the sidelines, a spectator to a transformation once would have led. When United takes delivery of its first A321XLR this year in 2026, the iconic Boeing narrowbody will begin its inevitable final approach after a stellar career spanning over 4 decades. A Boeing replacement remains just an elusive dream, perpetually deferred, endlessly studied, never quite launched. The sky does not wait, it simply moves on.